Welcome to NucleCast, the official podcast of the NWA Deterrence Center. Our host is Dr. Adam Lowther, co-founder and vice president for research at the National Institute for Deterrence Studies. The NWA Deterrence Center is a 501c3 organization ensuring a broader understanding of the nation's strategic nuclear deterrent and its ongoing modernization. Thank you for listening and welcome to the show. The views of the host and the guests are their own.
Welcome back to another great episode of NucleCast, the podcast of the NWA Deterrence Center. Of course, I'm your host, Adam Lowther, and today we have Chris Stone. Now, Chris is the host of another podcast called Real Space Strategy. So if you've never checked it out, make sure you check it out. Chris focuses on, space issues, but, like many space folks, he spent his time in the nuclear world as well. And Chris listened to the episode where I got to be the guest and talk about dynamic parity. And he even went the extra step and read the dynamic parity strategy. And so he contacted us. Of course, I know Chris. And he said, hey, we should have let's do an episode where we debate dynamic parity because I think you're missing some stuff. And I said, that'd be a great episode. So let's do it. So Chris, welcome to NucleCast.
Thanks. Appreciate it.
So, dynamic parity is this is a strategy that Curtis McGiffin and I sort of devised. And, I think I said in the podcast, it's what we thought was the minimum necessary to achieve effective deterrence. So, we may always aspire, like I've said before, I wish the United States was the only country in the world that had nuclear weapons. But in an environment absent where that's true, we thought dynamic parity would be an effective approach. Now, there were some areas where you thought, Adam, I may think you're a good guy, but I think you got this one wrong. So, Chris, let me turn it over to you and let's go through that.
Sure. So as you did mention, I do have a little bit of nuclear background. So I did missiles briefly when Space and Missiles was one mission area. But and I'm also sort of a graduate of the Defense and Strategic Studies program. So I've been educated by proteges of Herman Kahn and others like Keith Payne and things of that sort. So a lot of my ideas already kind of synced with his, and that's probably part of the reason why I thought, hey, I want to go read from this. But so there are a couple things that I noticed that I thought was interesting in the paper. One thing is I'm not a fan of the word parity, and so in my mind, parity should never be a goal of the United States when it comes to military-related stuff. And in my mind, when you look at how the Schelling mindset of parity in the Cold War happened, it didn't really work out so well. And I don't think it'll work now, especially, back then you had 1.5 powers of concern, the Chinese early days, and obviously then the Soviet Union, now Russia. Superiority and having the ability for escalation dominance is key for credible deterrence. I mean, I've read other people who have tried to redefine deterrence to mean something it never was and never will be, and I don't see how being equal with your adversary, even though in this case the paper talks about the U.S. being equal to 3 countries combined, I still, based on all the logic of our former forebears, who seem to understand that the whole point of the weapon systems is to be sort of an insurance policy, that obviously you don't want to exhaust your insurance policy on one problem. You want to have enough of a coverage that you can use it for multiple events. So if deterrence fails, you got to have the ability to win the war. And if you're equal to all 3, which have been working together more tightly lately, you're not going to be dealing with them individually, most likely. If you have parity, it only takes one small advantage to shift the apple cart in favor of the enemy, and then we lose. So one thing to remember that I've noticed in 15 plus years of working out here is that if you want something to be certain in a way of force posture, or you want to have a certain number of weapons, or you want to have a certain number of personnel, that you have to ask for way more than the minimum that you need and then negotiate down to somewhere. You don't start at the minimum as a way to try to convince people. So it's just a reality. And unless your side has super majorities in both houses of Congress, even then it can be a challenge because you get guys or girls that decide they want to show their own independence, and then that creates problems. But you likely won't get everything anyway. But arguing for parity with the combined forces of the top four threats, I don't think is very wise. The next thing I'll mention briefly is arms racing.
Well, let's
Um,
talk. Let's take
yeah.
them one at a time so that
Okay.
we don't want to
All
overwhelm the listeners. So
right.
let me address sort of your premise of parity, because this is one that other people have brought up and they said, "Hey, man, we don't like this idea that all you want is parity. Clearly, superiority is better." And sort of in principle, I agree with you. I always want to have more than than the adversary in the conventional realm and the nuclear realm. But our premise was to be, in some respects, pragmatic in that we thought parity was a stretch, trying to achieve parity with, Russia. For example, Russia can break out at any time, and they can break out effectively. They can manufacture pits. They've got their industrial base has already modernized, 90+% of their nuclear force. So they have a capability that we really haven't proven that we can do. Then we've got, the Chinese. I think the Chinese numbers are significantly higher than we're told. And if, let's suppose that in this new relationship between Russia and China, that, enriched uranium and plutonium, or pits or whatever, however they want to ship it, but that special nuclear material is given, to the Chinese to speed up their building of weapons. Our ability to effectively counter that it's just non-existent. We couldn't match. So we thought our stretch goal was parity, because we thought superiority is effectively unachievable. So we thought, rather than shooting for what's sort of the popular thing now is strategic sufficiency, which is, if I only need one ICBM to take out, 6 silos, that have 6 Chinese ICs, and each of those ICs has, let's say, 4 warheads or 4 reentry vehicles, then I only need one for 24. That's sort of the strategic sufficiency argument. We're saying, no, you need more than that. That's fundamentally insufficient. But that's sort of the predominant view right now, strategic sufficiency. And we're saying, no, you got to shoot for more. And so our premise was not necessarily in fundamental disagreement with you of superiority, but just that, dynamic parity would be a pretty heavy reach. And so we thought, let's not go for the extreme. Let's go for something more reasonable, but is still a stretch goal. And so, and then even, if we look at, like, go back to the 1970s and 80s, it was like Harold Brown, when he said, we build, they build, we stop, they build. And, late in the Cold War, the Soviets had 31 or 32, and we had 24. And there comes a point at which you say, well, another 5 or 6,000 is not gonna, we're all gonna perish anyway, so we don't really need to build beyond. Now, I don't think we're at that point now, and we're not. It's certainly, and I'm really concerned about our tactical nuclear deficit. That's where I think the biggest gap that the Russians and the Chinese think they can fill, or think they can sort of coerce us, is in that area. So that I would like to see us build capability there. Mm-hmm. And that's where we need the biggest ramp up, I would submit. And so, that's sort of just our take, was not in fundamental disagreement with you, but just in thinking about where are we in our modernization, right? We haven't fielded a single modernized, weapon and delivery vehicle yet. And we're 15 years into modernization. So our view that we could get through Congress and then effectively do it in terms of fielding a superior arsenal was one, we just thought, I don't know that we could do either one of those.
Yeah, well, I get that, but here's the thing. On the pragmatic side, I personally think that the not this most recent NPR nuclear posture review, but the one before, the one during the last administration,
Yeah.
um, because I know a few guys who were on that, and they told me that the reason why they were pushing for the buildup of the tactical so-called non-strategic nukes was because we had more capability to build that in shorter term than the big guns,
Yeah.
and that was a way to fill the gap in numbers, until we could get to dealing with the big guns. And I understand I understand that. I think that was a decent idea, and I think that was good until the current administration killed it, um, which I thought was unwise. As the other side continues to build up, somehow our goodness is going to prevail, despite the fact that we're going to be overloaded. But the other thing is about the big guns. Yeah, we have Sentinel. It's supposed to replace the missile I'm familiar with, which is Minuteman III, and I just, you know, we are not even close to parity on that, on the big guns. I think personally, from everything that I've heard from friends related to Sentinel, is I don't know why they decided they needed to build a brand new missile, because basically the Minuteman III that are in the hole right now are pretty much new missiles, because we've back when I was a missileer, we were replacing the first stage and all the different stages. We replaced the MGS guidance can. We replaced everything except pretty much the warheads. Has been updated, and of course we had to maintain but not update the launch facilities and things. And so instead of just fixing the missile, they want to fix everything. So that's what's slowing us down. I just personally I don't understand the decision making for that, and that's what's slowing us down. But I think back to your point about numbers, one thing that I've learned a great deal from reading such books on Thomas Power, who was the SAT commander back in the early 60s, is one of his arguments and of course now I understand our missiles and everything have more precision, because we've gotten better with that. But at the same time, if you're talking about a percentage of kill, percentage of destruction, even with our precision, with so few weapons, and it's being self-restrained to one warhead per missile, despite the other side blowing it off completely. I think you're still having a lower percentage of destruction on targets, and you're only going to have so much left, um, if you get into an exchange with one of the three, that you're not going to have a credible deterrent left over, because you're not going to want to, unless it's a really bad day, you're not going to all call enable everything and fire everything. Um, so I just think that parity if you get to parity, you're not going to be at what you need for the percentage of destruction. You're not going to be psychologically where you need to be to overwhelm them in their minds. Because from what I've read and understood from years of working this area, is the Russians and the Chinese have lots and lots of people, and they have well, not so much the Russians, but the Chinese especially, and they have a different philosophy on just acceptable losses, I guess I'll put it.
Yeah.
And
Casualties.
so, and
Yeah.
especially the Chinese. So, if we're all worried about, oh, we're going to hurt them, well, yeah, that's kind of the point. And if they're not psychologically worried about it because they have, X number of billion people and they're willing to sacrifice them, or the Russians just, are willing to push the bluff because of, obviously, if you're dealing with a country who doesn't care about civilian casualties, like just look at Aleppo. They're bombing and leveling a whole city in Syria just to get after a few people. They're not really worried about precision. So I don't think that they would be in agreement with that. If we go for parity, they're still going to go for more. And I just I don't think that would be a wise choice. And with a stretch goal, I get that concern. But again, as I've seen, if you want, I really don't think we've been modernizing, to be honest with you. We've just been updating things. There's a difference between just updating a few parts here and there and actually modernizing. Um, I think I was on another program with you, where another person commenting said that we need to get back to actual testing and not just
Yeah.
modeling in sim. I mean, we got all these things that we need to be doing for deterrence, and we're not doing it because we're trying to be a kinder, gentler thing, and it's not the world we live in. So, but anyway,
Yeah,
that's parity. I have more to say, but I also have like three other points.
yeah. There's the only other thing I would say is in parity, we wanted superiority in, if you look at reliability and effectiveness, and like you said, better CEPs, better probabilities of kill than Russian weapons. I mean, we've seen, and we really don't know that much about Chinese systems, how effective they are, but we've seen that Russian systems, there was a Sarmat failed test. There's problems that the Russians can have, and so therefore that creates the potential for us to have superiority just in the quality of our assets. So, I mean, that was sort of the way we wanted to do it. And then we were thinking in psychological terms, because how do we prevent arms racing? And we thought, if we essentially give the adversary, this mechanism of, hey, what we'll be a peer, we won't, seek superiority, and then therefore, if you move down because you don't want to go in this direction, we'll follow you. And so it's also, we wanted to create a mechanism where you don't have to have specified arms control, that you can build into the approach a mechanism for reductions. Now we're at the halfway point of this episode, and as always, we like to try to take a quick break. So you're listening to NucleCast, and I'm Adam Lowther, and Chris Stone's with me today, and we'll be right back. This episode of NucleCast is brought to you by the ANWA Deterrence Center, whose mission is to educate Americans about the nuclear enterprise and strategic deterrence. And we're back, and we're talking to Chris Stone, and he reached out and said, hey, I want to talk dynamic parity. I heard the episode, read the paper, and I had some questions. So we talked about the idea of parity in the first half of the show. Now, you had some other points you wanted to bring up. So
Yeah,
I'll turn it back over to you, Chris.
sure. So you had mentioned before the break preventing arms races, and that was another one of my thoughts. Is there's in my mind there's nothing wrong with an arms race, especially if the enemy is already engaged in such behavior.
Which they
So
are, by the way. They are. They're
correct.
outracing us.
So if the language you're using is trying to appease a certain group of folks within the policy sphere of the United States and Europe, they need to understand that, just because you choose not to run doesn't mean that you're not in a race.
Yeah.
And as you know, and you should be wanting to win the race. So if the adversary is about numbers, then numbers are important. So even if you
Yeah.
want to make the argument that numbers aren't important, we have quality, it's not going to impact the adversary because they have more and they could saturate us in their minds, and therefore who cares if we have one or two that can hit the target better than theirs when they can go old school and saturate. um, so yeah, I mean, if you're not competing, you're forfeiting. And just say it's like trying to run a race as a guy who used to run cross country. It's like, you're at a race and you're prepared and you've got the right shoes and you got the uniform on, but you're not willing to actually run it. You're still going to lose. So,
Yeah. No, I mean, I don't fundamentally disagree with you. The challenge is we don't have the right shoes, and we don't have the uniform, and we haven't trained. I mean, let's be honest, we haven't trained to run this race. We've essentially done nothing, and what we've done is we've watched our adversaries, train day after day. We've watched them go out and build these super cool uniforms that wick sweat away and do all these cool things, and they've got these great shoes that are, the best out there. And then they're like, okay, we're taking off, and we're like, but we don't feel like we need to beat you, right? We just want to be friends. We want to be your friend. We don't want to have to race, because we want everybody to get a trophy.
yeah.
We don't want there to be winners and losers, right?
Well,
And
that's not a good way to think in this world.
but
In
that's
this
how that's
particular.
that's where
I
we are
know.
in this country. And so our premise is, hey, let's start training. Let's start, let's go after some athletic gear. Let's get some good shoes. And then let's try to at least run with the, other folks, at least run with them. I mean, it's not that that Curtis and I don't want to win. It's that we can't even, get people to believe that we should run with people, with our
Yeah.
adversaries. That's the challenge. And
Yeah.
even today, even in this modern world, as you know, you've still got the disarmament community advocating to eliminate the Sentinel program and eliminate ICBMs. And I keep wondering, like, why do you hate IC? I've always wondered, why do you hate ICBMs? Do you understand that our adversaries, that's where they primarily focus their nuclear arsenals? So there's got to be some value to them because our adversaries put their eggs in that basket.
And
And
they're
so,
expanding them too.
yeah, the capabilities, and that's part of the reason Sentinel is, at least to me, important, is because it has the ability to penetrate advanced air defenses in a way that Minuteman doesn't, through a whole set of capabilities we can't really talk about here. But it's just, it's unfathomable to me, the debate that we're having in this country, which is a debate that the Russians and the Chinese and the North Koreans and the Iranians are not having.
Yeah. Well, and the other thing about arms races is the phrase in the report, arms reacting. Um,
Sure.
when you're dealing with a threat from a proactive enemy like the Chinese, whose mentality is attack to deter, and that's in space, but it's also
Sure.
everywhere else. That's another proposition for losing that I think we need to educate these people on, and that's why podcasts like this exist, and people need to lobby like crazy because we've had 30 years of habit of thinking it's a nice to have, it's not an important part of our defense architecture. And there have been several books that people apparently haven't been reading about the second nuclear age, and some people argue there's a third, about how the utility of a nuclear weapon, whether big or small, has increased, not decreased.
I
And the
agree.
fact that you see proliferation, obviously the Proliferation Security Initiative and the Missile Technology Control Regime clearly are not working. As we're seeing those three countries, swapping missiles and components and selling them and all sorts of stuff. So if you're always responding, then you're behind the curve all the time. And there is another book that it's old, and I think some of the authors have passed. Unfortunately, it's called "Winning the Technological War." Um, I think it was by Purnell, if you're familiar with
Yeah.
Purnell. And basically, he was saying that arms races is essentially a technological war. It's no different. Arms races is a term that arms control people use that sounds bad in the minds of people, but all it is staying ahead of it's basically that whole struggle between offense and defense. If someone has a superior offense, you have to build a better defense to counteract that, and then vice versa, and that process keeps going and going and going. Well, that's just how life is in the international system. That's not abnormal. That's normal. And so for those that have problems wrapping their heads around, oh, arms races are bad, you got to understand that in order to mitigate those situations requires strength. It doesn't require you to say, hey, we should ban things, because as I've mentioned on numerous posts and LinkedIn's, and sometimes I think maybe on your program, is Hague and Geneva and all these other treaties. These two particular, the biggest ones, China and Russia, have a notorious history of using them as long as it gives them time to rearm, and then they abrogate it, and they like, oh, we don't care. And that's why most of these post-Cold War treaties are dead. Even if we are still clinging on to some of them, they're dead because of the other player that is the problem, not us. So you can't expect people to follow our lead when they haven't been following our lead for 30 years. So I just think maybe it's semantics, but when you call it arms reacting, if you're reacting, you're already behind. And
Yeah. See,
so,
our premise for arms reacting was essentially in numbers, not necessarily in capability. So our premise was that you have to essentially return your nuclear enterprise to what it was, during the Cold War, in its ability to constantly be building and replacing warheads, constantly be building and replacing delivery vehicles, such that you're always ahead in the technology, because every 10 years or so you're replacing systems
Hmm.
and your technology is better. Our reacting is focused on numbers, in the sense that if the Russians were to say, "Hey, we want to go down," let's say the Russian economy tanks again, or because their population is tanked, they just can't afford it, or the oil dries up,
Hmm.
whatever the thing may be, and they say, "Hey, we want to go down 1,000," then we say, "Okay, you go down, we'll go down." So we would react to their desire to move down. Or if they say, "Hey, we can't field the conventional force, so therefore we're going to build up," then we'll say, "Okay, we'll build up." But the idea is
Yeah.
our technology is still better.
Yeah, well, that relates to another thing when you said mitigate in the report, mitigate advantage without seeking American advantage. The problem is most of these previous arms control treaties, where when we respond to things like that, is they always end up with higher numbers than we do. We're always willing to take a
Yeah,
lower number,
we have.
and
That's
and
true.
and the whole point of advantage is advantage. And you could say we have better technology, but if it's not deployed, who cares? Like in the space world, we keep talking about, oh, we have space superiority and technological capability. Great. None of that's deployed. We have no weapon systems deployed. So you could say we have better quality, but if we still are lower in numbers and lower in the ability to, with a high enough survival rate of a first strike or something, then you're not good. That's another reason why the SAT guys asked why we had so many ICBMs back in the day. It wasn't because they thought we needed them just for, I mean, there were several reasons. One of them was survivability. Second was because you had to have a probability of kill, and if you really wanted 100% or at least 90% with the bombers and everything like that all working together, you know, the bombers might get intercepted, the missiles might fail. There's all sorts of things that could happen, and in order to make sure that you were in a position that you weren't going to get a bunch of duds, you had to have enough of them. We in the post Cold War thought, oh well, this is not really a big deal anymore, so we can deal with you know 450 missiles in one wing now instead of 2000 spread across whatever, and now we have just three locations
Yeah,
that everybody knows.
you bring up a
So
good point, and it goes back to this. So if you go, I think I've mentioned this numerous times, and that is that, during the Vietnam conflict, it took 55,000 rounds of small arms ammunition to kill each, NVA soldier. And so we clearly needed, it was not a 1-to-1 ratio, one bullet, one kill. That was never the way it worked. And then here, Curtis was looking at this, and during OIF, we expended 250,000 rounds per per kill in those conflicts. So you needed more, 5 times more than you needed in Vietnam. And in our era of precision and stuff, you needed a lot more. And so this view that, well, we've got 1,000 targets, we've got 1,000 weapons, and 1,000 weapons on 1,000 targets. That's just how it works. One weapon, one kill. And it's never worked that way in warfare. It's never worked that way. Lots
especially
of
when you're not postured like we are, like our bombers aren't postured for like a 3-minute takeoff like they used to. We're not postured even for any of that. Frankly, we rotate, as I understand it by the public releases. We just rotate. Now there is talk about bringing them on alert. I think one of the senators or congressmen was talking about that, and I'm like, great, but we only have like 60 bombers where we used
yeah,
to have thousands of them. By the way, I will say that with your point that you made about when I was talking about the lead by example, I know you guys agree with me on that. There was a great statement in there that I do agree with, that 30 years is, obviously failed to convince the adversary that leading by example does anything. I agree with that. I also agree with your position on arms control agreements influencing behavior. So I don't disagree with everything in the paper. I just want you to know that. But I thought, I think if
You
you
want
like I
more.
said,
You
well,
want more.
it's just a fact of life. If you want to not be destroyed, Congress, then you're going to have to change your priorities and fund things that you need. And if you want to get, I mean, minimum deterrence and nuclear zero, that's over with. That 30-year pipe dream is dead. Because we're being encircled as we speak by a combined fleet of Chinese and Russian airplanes and ships. By the way, if you aren't seeing it in the news, you have to look for it, but it's there on their major exercise. And they're penetrating our air defense zones again with their bombers. They're drop launching missiles to demonstrate they can, and yet we're acting like it's still the 1990s when the Russians can't do anything. So obviously, the biggest exercise since the 1970s, and people are still sleeping, it seems.
I'll be
So,
honest with you. I think that the fundamental reason we're seeing this sort of ostrich strategy is because if you look at the federal budget and state budgets, right? So the federal budget, about 70% of the federal budget is in mandatory spending. It's Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and then other handout programs. And then if you look at state budgets, 40% of each of the 50 states' budgets is in welfare programs. Just the welfare programs, and that doesn't even include all the other things where we distribute income. So if you look at the 8.5, $9 trillion, well, if you include all that we borrow, it's 10 or 12 trillion that the federal and state governments spend. 2/3 of it or more is in redistribution of income. And so for a member of Congress to go to that huge voting block and say, hey, we're going to stop giving you free money. Now, Social Security and Medicare, that's a very complex topic. That it's sort of not free, but in many cases it eventually becomes free money because of how they've built those programs. But that we who are defense advocates are not a big enough voting block to go to Congress and say, vote to stop the Russians and the Chinese and spend less on, these entitlement programs. It's so for members of Congress, they would rather just keep their head in the sand, hope that we have a minimum enough to keep them at bay because they're trying to win the next election. And this is what you
well,
see. This is the fundamental problem. This is why we're in the position we're in, is because entitlement programs buy more votes than defense programs do, and
well,
that's it.
I would say just quickly that I don't think that I think there's enough federal budget that even in the Department of Defense and Energy and everything else that if people would prioritize things or then we would be able to make it work. Like here's an example between the services, it's not an equal pie share.
True.
So in the 1950s, when they were building up Strategic Air Command, the Air Force, the SAC piece of the Air Force, got a majority of the defense budget
Yeah, I did.
because they had to build it up rapidly in order to make sure that we weren't schwacked by the Soviet Union. And they had plenty of education and decent public relations to explain why, hey, the Russians could attack at any time because this is their nature, thanks to the Kennan telegram. And we need to be prepared for this. Otherwise, we're all going to get killed because this is a different situation. This is not, the oceans aren't going to protect us. And we've been hearing that forever. The oceans aren't going to protect us. But then we go back to sleep again because we tell everybody we're fine all of a sudden, and we're not. So it's their responsibility as representatives to not only represent the interest, but to make sure that, hey, this is what I'm hearing from the executive branch on our threats. And until we can get that message out, they have to make the best decisions they can. But then if we end up getting destroyed, they're going to say, why didn't you do this? It's the same old thing. So I don't think that Social Security and all the other stuff is as big of a deal. I also would mention, I don't know if you knew this, but most of the states, half of their budgets are actually come from federal money.
Yeah,
I don't
there's
know if you knew
tons
that
of
or not, because the federal government gives the states money to make them follow federal rules instead of the states doing their own thing. It's sort of like, if you do what we say, we'll give you cash, and you can use it in your state budgets. Oh, okay, great. So at least I know in one state that I'm from, that's the case. It may not be in every state, but
yeah,
anyway.
in those entitlement programs, it's usually about a 60-40 or 55-45, kind of like with Medicare and Medicaid particularly. So, and then there's some with education, and but I get your point. It's although I'm probably more skeptical in, I mean, we have this golden mean with the services that's, popped up, and if you look at defense spending, it's been consistently on the decline as a percentage of the total budget. And
Yeah, the GDP.
yeah, I mean, well, even as a percentage of the budget, not just GDP, but as a
Yep.
percentage of the budget, it's been on the decline, and so it's one of those things where I don't see how you change that, given American politics today. And this is if you look at Europe, we're sort of 20 years behind Europe. And, this is the European problem today. How do they fund them? They can't tax more because they already tax at rates that, sort of, they violate the Laffer curve already. So I'm not sure
Well,
how they fix that. So but it's a great question. It's been unfortunately we're at the 36-minute mark, so we've gone over time. We try to stay. NucleCast is that on the way to work or on the way home podcast that you can listen to, and so we don't want to violate that rule. And so, Chris, thanks for reaching out. Thanks for coming on and having a great discussion. I have a feeling a lot of folks sort of who read the dynamic parity report thought sort of similar to the way you did, and they want superiority. And so thanks for coming on and giving voice to those concerns. It was a great discussion.
thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Of course, I also want to thank you, the listeners, and we'll see you on the next episode.
This has been a production of the ANWA Deterrence Center, a 501c3 that seeks to educate key decision makers, stakeholders, and the public to ensure a broader understanding of the nation's strategic nuclear deterrent. Our executive producer is Kimberly Charrington, and this episode has been engineered and mixed by David Grunthal. Help us grow our followers by sharing it and follow the show on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter at NucleCast.